Good day and welcome. Today I'm going to talk about Count Zero, a 1986 novel from William Gibson. Um, when I had first started reading William Gibson, I always thought Neuromancer was really the best novel and I really enjoyed it more. But as time went on, Neuromancer started to get a lot more dated, and I really, over the years, come to appreciate Count Zero a lot more. It is the second book in the Sprawl series. It's a continuation of Neuromancer. And as mentioned in Neuromancer, at the end of the novel, the AI manages to transcend humanity and starts getting involved with things that are transcendent and not particularly relevant to humans. Skipping forward, we get to Count Zero, where William Gibson does one of the things he starts to do, I think, in all of his stories, where he'll have two or three main plot lines that don't seem connected, and then at the end he kind of ties everything together and wraps it up. And I've been thinking about this, and I'm trying to remember. To me, William Count Zero was the first place that I've ever seen that particular story device, and the story device of having multiple plot lines is obviously fairly old. In Lord of the Rings, you see the Fellowship breaks up, and then there's three different stories. But the stories are, let's say, aware of each other and related to each other. Whereas in Count Zero, you read about Bobby, who is an aspiring cyber cowboy, and you're like, okay. And then it'll flip over to Turner, who's a corporate extraction specialist, and you're like, you read them, they're good stories, they're fun, they're enjoyable. It's like, well, how are these related? Well, in the end, everything gets tied together, and you're like, oh, well, that's how they're related. It's something that Gibson seems to do in most of his novels that I've read, and it's, I don't know, the first couple times you read it, it's interesting, and then once you know he's going to do that, then you start wondering, okay, well, how is he going to tie all these storylines together? And it's, not as interesting, but it doesn't really take away from the story. The interesting thing about Count Zero is it was written in 86, as mentioned, and that's kind of peak Japanophilia. And by that, I mean, uh, in the 70s, Japan had started to rebuild after World War II, and they were starting to try and get into the American markets. And people had this kind of contemptuous opinion that selling cars, in the 70s, Japanese selling cars is just like, why would anybody buy a Japanese car? You want a good, solid American car. And well, it turns out that the American car makers kind of forgot who their customers were, and people were focused on living the good life and not making quality cars. And the Japanese were very, very quality focused. And I know in the modern day, it's like, well, everyone's quality focused. There's TQM, there's Six Sigma, all these quality programs, and everybody seems to be obsessed with qualities. But in the 70s, that wasn't really the case. TQM, Six Sigma, all these things just really weren't things. So, the Japanese came in and they really built in this obsession with quality, and they really just absolutely devastated the American car market. And the big three, the big three car manufacturers, who they were at the time, GM, Chrysler, and Ford, started to suffer market share and losses, and then you saw layoffs, and everyone took this attitude that the Japanese have clearly cracked the code for how to be successful and how to compete, and the Americans just can't compete with them. And if you read about it, there was this kind of mixture of uh, government control shielding private companies, and the strong culture, corporate culture, etc. And when you read William Gibson, that's really, really very plain. Most of the Turner works for a Japanese corporation. Well, several Japanese corporations. He tends to hire himself out where needed. Bobby's using a Japanese cyber deck, and there's all kinds of Japanese terms scattered throughout the book, and like I said, peak Japanophilia. Um, Towards the 90s, Japan had a little bit of a difficult time. Their markets didn't work. Anyways, obviously Japan is still a strong country, but it's not. People don't look at it as the Japanese are going to dominate us right now. There's the sense that China kind of fills that role of the 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 country that will displace America on top of the world, so to speak. We'll see what happens. It's 2024. The future is not written yet. But anyway, so off to count zero. So you have these two threads that are moving in parallel. Um, Bobby Newmark, who goes by the name of Count Zero, which is an archaic hacker term, um, has discovered black ice, which is ICE's intruder countermeasure electronics, which then gets into your computer, and because your computer is kind of hooked up to your brain, causes you to die. And somehow he saves himself. Well, somehow someone else saves him. So there's a thread where people try and get in touch with him to figure out what happened, and that relates to the what happened to Neuromancer after Neuromancer transcended humanity. The second thread is you have Turner, who does corporate extractions, and I know that's going to seem kind of strange, but back in the 80s you had lifetime contracts, and in William Gibson world, they took those lifetime contracts very seriously. Job hopping was discouraged. I know to people in this day and age that seems like a absolutely bizarre idea, but there it is. And so what Turner would do was he would have literally armed troops, and he would kidnap executives that wanted to move jobs. So if you were working at, say, Amazon and you wanted to work at Microsoft, and your Amazon contract said, well, you can't do this, then Turner would come in, kidnap you, take you to a corporate owned Microsoft space, and then you could switch jobs. Again, not really, that was a big deal when lifetime jobs were a thing. People kind of imagine, well, if there are lifetime jobs and non compete contracts, how do we take that to an extreme? And that was a thing, but obviously not a thing today. So Turner's been asked to get a scientist out of Moss Neotech and transfer him, but unfortunately the scientist doesn't come, and he sends his daughter, and so Turner has to figure out what to do with a 16-year-old girl. And eventually the threads all tie together, and you're like, oh, well, that was a pretty cool story. So I think part of the reason that I've come to like Count Zero a lot more is because I've found as I've gotten older Turner to be a much more interesting character. Um, Bobby Newmark is, he's a teenage kid that got over his head, and people are trying to keep him safe, and other people are trying to not keep him safe, and he's kind of in the middle of the battle, going, I have no idea what's going on, but I'm going to run with it, and he thinks he's a lot more adept than he is, and he's a kid with a big ego and not a lot of experience that's trying his best, and he learns along the way. So okay, interesting to read, but not really. I don't find him a compelling character. Turner, on the other hand, um, I've just over the years really come to enjoy who he is and what he does, and there's lots of other the characters are all very interesting. One of the things that Neuromancer did is it became Neuromancer, the AI, became self-aware, and then its consciousness, for lack of a better term, shattered. Um, and the various pieces of Neuromancer start manifesting in the Matrix as voodoo gods. So you have a generation of console cowboys, computer hackers, whatever you want to call them, who also have to be aware of voodoo and can engage in voodoo rituals to help them become better hackers. So That's the story. Like I said, it's very compelling. And one of the nice things about it versus Neuromancer is it holds up a lot more. The idea of corporate cultures and switching companies and corporate loyalty and what does corporate loyalty mean, um, enables the book to be a lot more relevant. Neuromancer being focused around the early internet or cyberspace as the term was coined, that not so interesting. But Count Zero tends to be focused a lot in the physical world. There is cyber activity going on. People are doing computer hacking, um, but there's a lot of focus on the physical world, which is one of the reasons why I think the story holds well. Um, because when you look at William Gibson's vision of the future, you've got BAMA, which is the Boston Atlanta Metropolitan Axis. It's basically from Boston all the way to Atlanta is a string of suburbs that's all connected. And then you have the interior, or as it's called today, flyover country, which is more or less like flyover country is. There's people there and they're doing their things, but the smart, sophisticated people are in that live in Bama, and Bama, Boston, Atlanta metropolitan access, not Bama, Alabama, and so they do smart, sophisticated people thing, and of course there's criminals and etc. All across the board. But I think by anchoring the book in the physical world rather than the cybernetic world, his vision of the future holds up very well and is very convincing. And a story about people doing physical things while enhancing their activities with computers, it makes a lot of sense. As I said, the characters are interesting. I really like Turner. Bobby Newmark is okay, and some of the side characters get introduced. They're fun and interesting and enjoyable. So overall, this I will actually recommend. If you have listened this far, I appreciate your time, and we'll talk to you later.